A black teacher, Elijah Carter, was heading home after receiving a prestigious award for his contributions to education. Exhausted but proud, he stepped into the train station, ready to return to his family. But the moment he crossed the platform, everything changed. A station security officer, driven by prejudice, targeted Elijah without reason, questioning his ticket, his identity, and eventually humiliating him in front of curious onlookers. Just 10 minutes later, the officer was escorted off the premises. What happened next shocked the entire station and sparked a chain of events no one could have anticipated. Stay with me. This is a story that needs to be told. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find Elijah's story as powerful as we do, make sure to share it. It started as just another evening commute. The air was thick with the quiet hum of the city, though the street seemed deserted except for the echoes of Elijah Thomas's footsteps against the worn pavement. Harlem wasn't the place it used to be. At least not in the way his memory clung to it. The brownstones still stood tall and defiant, but time had painted them with a layer of weariness, like elders watching the world unfold without interference. Elijah adjusted the brim of his hat and kept walking. The sun, now lazily sinking into the horizon, left streaks of orange bleeding into the sky. The diner on the corner. He remembered it well. His father used to bring him here on Sunday afternoons after church. But as Elijah approached, he realized the warm glow of nostalgia was a fragile thing. A small, "Help Wanted" sign flickered in the window, curling at the edges as though it had been there long enough to outlive any real hope. Inside, the bell above the door sang as he entered. The smell of coffee lingered, mixing with the faint scent of grease from the kitchen. A few heads turned, most didn't. Elijah made his way toward a booth in the back, where the leather seats were cracked but familiar. The waitress, a slender white woman with tired eyes, hesitated when she noticed him. She approached, her notepad in hand. "Coffee? Please," Elijah replied, keeping his tone polite, though he noted the way her eyes drifted to the clock. The unspoken stretched thin between them. Nothing outright, just the kind of pause that spoke louder than it should. He recognized it, that subtle hesitation, the brief flicker of doubt that rested behind someone's gaze when they weighed who you were against who they thought you should be. "You sure you want to sit in the back?" she asked. Her voice measured. Elijah's lips curled into the faintest smile. "I like the quiet." She nodded but said nothing more, scribbling on her pad before drifting away. Across the room, a group of men sat near the window. One of them, leaning back in his chair, tossed a glance in Elijah's direction. It wasn't hostile, not yet. It was the look of someone trying to figure out the shape of a stranger. Elijah folded his hands in front of him and waited. This was how it began. It never started with a shout or a pointed finger. No, the first thread of unraveling was always delicate, woven into the smallest gestures, the faintest glances. The world did not often announce its intentions. It whispered to them. The waitress returned, setting the cup down with a soft clink. The liquid inside rippled slightly from the weight of her hand. "Anything else?" "No, thank you." Elijah let the coffee sit untouched for a moment, his eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life, cutting lines through the soft dark that crept along the sidewalk. It was then that the door opened again. The bell chimed, and a young black boy stepped inside. Maybe 12, maybe younger. His clothes were neat but worn, and his eyes darted around the room as though searching for someone. The boy's gaze met Elijah's briefly, and in that flicker of a second, Elijah saw something he recognized. A shadow of what he once carried at that age. But the boy's presence did not go unnoticed. The man by the window. Elijah saw it in his eyes first. The way his posture shifted. How his jaw set a little too tightly. The boy took another step forward. Shoulders squared but small. "Are you looking for something?" the man by the window asked. His voice casual in the same way a snake could be still before striking. The boy hesitated, glancing around nervously. "He's fine," Elijah said, his voice breaking the space between them with quiet authority. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Didn't ask you." "I know," Elijah replied, lifting the coffee to his lips. "But you're speaking loud enough for the whole room to hear." A beat of silence settled over the diner, pressing down like the weight of too many things left unsaid. The boy took another step, then another, until he slid into a booth near the front. Elijah watched the man lean back slowly, his expression hard to read but simmering beneath the surface. It was a small thing, barely more than a ripple. But Elijah knew better. The quiet acts of cruelty often carried more weight than the ones that shouted. The waitress, watching the exchange from behind the counter, drifted toward the man's table, offering him a refill. Her silence was louder than Elijah's words had been. The boy glanced at him from the corner of his eye, offering a quick nod of thanks. Elijah nodded back, his grip tightening around the cup. The sun had long disappeared by the time he left the diner. But Elijah carried the weight of that evening with him as he stepped onto the street. The trouble, he knew, wasn't in what had happened. It was in what hadn't. The street was quieter than Elijah remembered. The city had a way of swallowing its own noise at night. But Harlem's stillness tonight felt different, like it was holding its breath. Elijah walked slowly, hands in his coat pockets, the weight of the diner still trailing behind him. He wasn't one to linger on things too long. But some moments weren't meant to slip away easily. The boy's face haunted him. The way he carried himself. The small flickers of defiance masking something more fragile. He passed the corner store where old Mr. Green sat behind the counter, counting coins by the dim glow of a single bulb. Further down, two men leaned against the wall, cigarettes dangling loosely from their lips, watching the world without saying much. Their eyes followed Elijah but said nothing. It wasn't until Elijah turned onto his street that the night's quiet was broken. Evening, Mr. Thomas. Elijah looked up and saw Mrs. Collier standing on her front stoop, arms crossed over her chest. She was a small woman but fierce, known in the neighborhood for settling disputes with a single look. Evening, Mrs. Collier. How's your husband? He's doing fine as a man can be in this world, she replied, the corners of her mouth twitching. How about you? You've been quiet lately. Elijah gave her a polite nod. Some days call for quiet. Mrs. Collier let out a dry chuckle. Ain't that the truth? He was about to step inside when she added, I heard about that boy at the diner. Elijah paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. Did you know? She nodded, her expression tightening. Word travels. That man by the window's been causing trouble for a while. Some folk just can't stand seeing things change, even if it's just a boy walking into the wrong place. Elijah sighed. It's always the small things. Mrs. Collier stepped closer, lowering her voice. Small things have a way of turning into bigger things. You know that as well as I do. Elijah met her gaze and saw the weight of years reflected back at him. She was right. The embers of these moments, left unchecked, could catch fire. Inside his apartment, Elijah sat by the window, watching the street. The soft glow of lights from other buildings painted shadows across his living room floor. He thought about his father. How he used to sit in the same spot, back when Elijah was a boy, watching for signs of trouble before it arrived. His father used to say, sometimes it ain't the fight you see coming that gets you. It's the one that creeps up behind you when you're not looking. Elijah wasn't sure if he agreed. The fights were always coming, seen or unseen. The next morning, Elijah found himself walking the same familiar route. The diner loomed at the corner like an old friend that had grown cold over time. He hadn't planned on stopping, but his feet carried him inside before his mind could protest. The same waitress was there, this time wiping down the counter. She glanced up, recognition flashing across her face. Back again? Elijah shrugged. Thought I'd see how the coffee tastes today. She smirked but said nothing, pouring him a cup without being asked. The bell above the door chimed softly as another customer entered. A white man in his 50s. Sharply dressed, briefcase in hand. He glanced at Elijah, his gaze lingering just long enough for Elijah to feel it. The man sat down near the front, his posture stiff, and waited. Morning, Mr. Simmons, the waitress greeted, her voice warmer than it had been for Elijah. Morning. The unspoken settled into the air between them. Elijah sipped his coffee and listened. Simmons leaned forward. I heard there was a little trouble here last night. The waitress stiffened, her hand pausing mid-wipe. It wasn't much. Just a misunderstanding. Simmons chuckled, shaking his head. Misunderstandings have a way of finding their way here, don't they? Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, but he stayed silent. Man like that. Simmons gestured vaguely in Elijah's direction, his voice lowering. Quote. Ought to know there are places folks don't belong. The words hung there like a thick fog. And for a brief second, Elijah considered letting them pass. But the weight of the boy's face from the night before crept back into his mind. Man like what? Elijah asked, his voice calm but cutting through the space between them. Simmons turned slightly, surprised that Elijah had spoken. I didn't mean anything by it. Elijah nodded slowly. I know. That's what makes it worse. The waitress shifted uncomfortably, casting Simmons a glance as if urging him to leave it alone. You see, Elijah continued, setting his cup down gently. It's not the words that matter most. It's the way you say them. Quiet enough that nobody notices until it's too late. Simmons stiffened. Look, I don't want any trouble. Elijah leaned back in his chair. Neither do I. But trouble has a way of finding people whether they want it or not. Silence settled once more, heavier this time. Simmons took his coffee to go, leaving without another word. When he was gone, the waitress approached Elijah carefully. You didn't have to do that. Elijah smiled faintly. Yes, I did. The bell chimed again, and Elijah looked up, half expecting another shadow from the past. But it was the boy from last night, hands tucked into his pockets, glancing around as if uncertain. Elijah nodded toward the seat across from him. You can sit here, if you'd like. The boy hesitated, then slid into the booth. Elijah waved the waitress over. Get him whatever he wants. It's on me. The waitress nodded, this time without hesitation. Small fires, Elijah thought. Best to put them out while you can. Elijah never believed in fate. It was too convenient, too neat for a world that often cracked at the seams. But if there was such a thing as rhythm, the pull and push of life, then he was beginning to feel it. And lately, that rhythm felt heavy. The morning after Simmons' departure from the diner, Elijah found himself standing on the steps of St. Luke's Church. It wasn't Sunday, and Elijah rarely stopped by during the week. But something about the way the wind cut through the trees outside his window that morning made him restless. Inside, the light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors along the worn wooden pews. The sanctuary smelled faintly of dust and aged leather. And somewhere in the distance, a creaking floorboard betrayed the presence of another visitor. Elijah, came a familiar voice. Reverend Mitchell emerged from the shadows near the altar, his thin frame wrapped in a navy cardigan. He walked with a slight limp, the kind that comes from years of standing in one place for too long. Reverend, Elijah greeted with a nod. You don't usually stop by in the middle of the week. I don't. Elijah glanced around, letting his gaze drift across the empty room. But something's been sitting on me. The Reverend chuckled softly. That's what these walls are for. Heavy things have a habit of finding their way inside here. They sat together in one of the pews, silence stretching between them like an old friend. Did you hear about the diner? Elijah finally asked. I heard, Reverend Mitchell replied. These things echo, even when we don't want them to. Elijah folded his hands. It's the small things that bother me the most. The way he spoke, the way folks around him nodded, even if they didn't say a word. Mitchell's gaze softened. The quiet ones hold the door open for the loud ones. It's always been that way. Elijah sighed. I suppose I thought by now those doors would be locked for good. The Reverend let the weight of that statement linger. You know better than most that some doors are built to stay cracked, just wide enough to let the wrong folks through. Elijah looked at him sharply. And what do we do? Stand guard forever? Mitchell smiled faintly. No, Elijah. We teach the ones who come after us how to build better doors. As they sat, the heavy oak doors of the church creaked open, and a young boy stepped inside. The same boy from the diner. His hesitant steps echoed through the vast space. And when he caught sight of Elijah, he straightened his posture but didn't move forward. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Are you following me now? The boy shrugged. I didn't know you'd be here. Mitchell chuckled. Seems you've made a friend. The boy edged closer but stopped just short of the pew. He looked at Elijah carefully. That man from last night, he's my neighbor. Mr. Simmons. Elijah's mouth tightened, but he kept his voice even. I figured as much. He's not bad. I mean, not all the time, the boy said, as if trying to convince himself. Elijah nodded slowly. Most people aren't all the time. But a little is still too much. The boy fidgeted with his hands. My mama says it's better to stay quiet when he starts talking like that. Your mama's not wrong, Elijah replied. But staying quiet doesn't mean you have to listen. Mitchell shifted, resting his hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. It's not about raising your voice all the time, son. Sometimes just standing firm is enough. The boy seemed to absorb those words, rolling them over in his mind like loose change. Before he left, Elijah walked him to the steps of the church. The afternoon sun was bright now, illuminating the streets below. You headin' home? Elijah asked. The boy nodded. Elijah crouched down so they were eye level. Next time Simmons talks like that, whether it's to you, your mama, or anyone else, you remember something for me. All right? The boy waited. His words belong to him. They don't belong to you. The boy's lips twitched into something like a smile before he hurried down the street. Elijah watched him go, hands resting on his knees, feeling the weight of doors. Some that had closed long ago. Others that were still waiting. Mitchell's voice drifted from behind him. You sure you're not meant to be preaching? Elijah? Elijah smirked but didn't turn around. No, Reverend, I'll leave that to you. But as the boy disappeared into the afternoon crowd, Elijah knew one thing for sure. He'd be standing guard a little longer. Just in case. It was in the small things. The glance that lingered too long. The handshake that never fully arrived. The sudden interest in the contents of one's pockets when crossing the street. Elijah had learned to measure time by them. The quiet hum of prejudice that filled the spaces between conversations. Louder than the words themselves. By Friday, the shape of that shadow pressed heavier on his shoulders. It wasn't just Simmons and the diner incident anymore. It was the way Mr. Peterson from the hardware store asked him twice if he needed any help finding something. Though Elijah had known exactly where the nails were kept since he was 15. It was the sudden shift in tone when Elijah's name was called at the post office and the clerk glanced at his return address. He hadn't moved houses, but sometimes it felt like the neighborhood was shifting beneath him. That evening, Elijah found himself at the barber shop. It wasn't a planned visit, but his feet carried him there as if searching for sanctuary. The smell of clove oil and aftershave wrapped around him like a familiar coat as he stepped inside. Even in, Elijah, called Thomas from the first chair, wiping down his clippers with a practiced rhythm. A few men sat scattered around the shop, exchanging easy conversation about last night's baseball game. The shop was a space apart from the world outside. But even here, Elijah felt it, thin, like a crack in the wall too small for the eye but wide enough for the wind to slip through. You look like you need a trim, Thomas said with a smirk, gesturing to the chair. Not yet, Elijah replied. Just sit, for a while. Thomas nodded and resumed his work. But his eyes flickered toward Elijah in the mirror. Sensing something unspoken, Elijah settled in the corner, leaning back with a quiet sigh. The sound of scissors snipping filled the space between idle chatter. Then, the door opened. Simmons walked in. The conversation in the shop slowed. Not enough to stop, but enough to notice. Gentlemen, Simmons greeted casually, as if the air hadn't thickened at his arrival. He strolled toward the counter, nodding at Thomas as he picked up a comb. Elijah met Simmons' eyes in the mirror. Didn't expect to see you here, Elijah said, voice steady but firm. Simmons smiled faintly. Needed a trim. Same as anyone else. Thomas paused, his hands resting lightly on the clippers. The tension rested just beneath the surface, like the stillness before a storm. You know, Simmons began, his eyes never leaving Elijah's reflection. Folks been talking since the other night. Elijah's grip on the armrest tightened slightly, though he kept his face calm. I imagine they have. Simmons chuckled softly, but the sound held no warmth. I suppose we all say things now and then that rub folks the wrong way. No hard feelings, right? The barbershop was silent now. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. Elijah straightened, his gaze steady. Hard feelings don't come from nowhere, Simmons, and they don't disappear just 'cause you feel like brushing them off. For a moment, Simmons said nothing. His hand flexed around the comb, tapping it lightly against the counter. You always been this serious, Elijah? He asked, his voice low. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Only when it matters. Simmons' eyes narrowed, but Thomas stepped in, his voice calm but resolute. Haircuts don't need conversation, gentlemen, Thomas said. I'll take care of whoever's next. Simmons hesitated but eventually relented, nodding as he took a seat a few chairs down. The tension eased, but not completely. As Thomas began trimming Simmons' hair, Elijah watched in the mirror. Simmons' reflection seemed smaller now, less certain, though the corners of his mouth still curled faintly in amusement. Elijah stayed for another 15 minutes. Long enough to make sure Simmons wasn't waiting for him outside. Long enough to remind him that his presence wasn't fleeting. By the time Elijah left, the sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. As he walked home, Elijah glanced at the sidewalk ahead, where the boy from the diner sat near the stoop of his building, bouncing a small rubber ball against the brick wall. The boy looked up as Elijah approached, his expression unreadable. Mr. Simmons was in the shop, Elijah said, stopping near the steps. The boy nodded. He's always around. Elijah knelt beside him, the creak in his knees louder than he'd care to admit. You remember what I told you? About his words? The boy nodded again. Good. Don't let his shadow follow you home. The boy's brow furrowed as if trying to understand. Shadows don't belong to you, Elijah added, his voice soft but firm. The boy gave a faint smile before returning to his game. And Elijah rose, continuing down the block with the quiet weight of knowing that some shadows never fully disappear. But even shadows, he thought, can't block out the sun. The summer heat hung over the city like a second skin, heavy and unrelenting. Elijah stood at the corner of Winston and Hayes. The weight of the day pressed into his back. But it wasn't just the heat that lingered. It was the gaze of a world that often stared too long or not at all. He had walked this route for years. Past the bakery with the cracked window. Past Mrs. Calloway's flower stand. Past the stoop where old Mr. Barnes played chess with himself. The streets hadn't changed much, but the way people moved through them had. It was a curious thing, Elijah thought, how the lines of a city could remain the same, yet feel different under the weight of silence. As he crossed the street, he caught sight of Simmons again, leaning against the side of the pharmacy, cigarette dangling from his lips. This time, Simmons didn't pretend not to notice him. Elijah, Simmons called out, his voice loud enough to carry but not enough to seem deliberate. Elijah slowed but didn't stop. Afternoon, Simmons. Walkin' like you own the block, Simmons said, the smoke curling lazily around his words. Elijah didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch between them, as if weighing the value of Simmons' observation. I don't own anything but the shoes on my feet, Elijah replied finally, but I walk like I know where I'm going. Simmons chuckled, but there was something underneath the sound. Something sharp. You always got an answer, don't you? Elijah paused just long enough to turn his head. Only when the questions are worth answering. A flicker of something passed across Simmons' face, but it disappeared just as quickly. He didn't press further, and Elijah kept walking, feeling the weight of Simmons' gaze trailing behind him like a stray dog that wouldn't quite leave. It wasn't Simmons' words that stuck with him, though. It was the knowledge that nothing about their exchange had been random. Later that evening, Elijah sat by his window. The streets below quiet save for the distant hum of life beyond the neighborhood. Amelia sat across from him, knitting quietly, though the clicking of her needles filled the room like a steady drumbeat. You ever wonder how long a man can stare at the same corner before he sees something different? Elijah asked, watching the faint orange glow of a street lamp below. Amelia didn't look up. Depends on the man, she replied. Some see it clearly for the first time. Others could stare their whole lives and miss it. Elijah smiled faintly, but the weight of the day pressed against his chest. I ran into Simmons again, he said finally. Now Amelia paused, setting her knitting aside. That man's got nothing better to do? I don't think it's about having something to do, I think it's about making sure I know he's there. Amelia leaned back, arms crossed. He doesn't need to remind you of that. We've known his kind long enough. Elijah nodded. He thought about the boy on the stoop. About the way Simmons' words had lingered in that diner, curling like smoke even after Simmons had left the room. He's not alone, Elijah said quietly. No, Amelia agreed. He's not. But neither are you. Her words settled over him. Soft but firm, like the weight of her hand on his shoulder. A few days later, Elijah found himself standing outside the church, watching as families filtered in for the afternoon service. He hadn't planned on staying long, but Pastor Graham caught sight of him from the steps. Elijah, the pastor called, waving him over with the enthusiasm of a man who greeted everyone as if they were long-lost friends. Reluctantly, Elijah made his way up the steps. Are you coming in today? Pastor Graham asked, his eyes warm but searching. Not today, Elijah replied, glancing at the door. Just passing by. The pastor nodded, but his gaze lingered. You know, sometimes it's the passing by that turns into staying. Elijah smiled faintly. I suppose you're right. Before he could turn to leave, the pastor's voice softened. Simmons has been around more than usual. Hasn't he? Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. He's always around. Pastor Graham studied him for a moment. His face unreadable. Be careful with that one. Elijah. Men like Simmons, they don't make noise because they want to be heard. They do it because they want to be seen. Elijah nodded, the pastor's words settling somewhere deep. As Elijah stepped back onto the street, he couldn't help but notice Simmons again. This time further down the block, leaning against the corner like a shadow that refused to move. The weight of the world didn't shift overnight. Elijah knew that much, but as he walked past Simmons without a second glance, he felt something different. A quiet resistance that didn't ask permission to exist. Simmons could watch all he wanted. Elijah would keep walking. The rain began without warning, sliding down the windowpane in long, crooked streaks. Elijah watched from his usual seat at the corner cafe, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Outside, the streets glistened under the dim light of a cloud-covered afternoon. It was a slow day, but the kind that felt restless underneath, like the city itself was holding its breath. Elijah's eyes shifted toward the far side of the street where Simmons stood, half shielded beneath the awning of a convenience store. It wasn't by chance. It never was. Amelia had told him not to let it bother him. Men like him, she'd said, are just waiting to see you blink first. But Elijah wasn't blinking. He took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, his reflection faint in the window. There was a time when he might have confronted Simmons outright, stripped away the thin veil that separated suspicion from accusation. But those days had passed. Now, Elijah knew better than to throw stones at shadows. Still, there was something different today. Simmons wasn't alone. 2 officers stood with him, their backs straight, their uniforms crisp, eyes scanning the street with a quiet authority. Simmons wasn't looking at Elijah. He was speaking to them. Elijah felt it before it happened, the same way you can feel the static in the air before lightning strikes. The cafe door opened with a soft chime, and for a moment, Elijah thought it might be someone familiar. But it wasn't. The officers stepped inside. Afternoon, one of them said, his voice even but heavy with intent. Elijah nodded slightly. Afternoon. The officer's eyes lingered, as if searching for something beyond the surface. You've been sitting here for a long time? Elijah's brow lifted, but he kept his tone light. Long enough to wonder why you're asking. The second officer shifted his weight. We had a report. A man matching your description loitering near the pharmacy. The owner said there's been trouble lately. Elijah leaned back, his hands still resting around the cup. I've been right here since noon. I haven't moved. The officers exchanged glances. Mind if we see some ID? Elijah set the cup down carefully, as if even that small action required precision. He reached for his wallet, pulling out the worn leather ID he'd carried for years. It wasn't the first time, and he doubted it would be the last. One of the officers studied it for a long moment before handing it back without a word. We appreciate your cooperation, the first officer said, but there was no gratitude in his voice. Elijah held his gaze. I imagine you do. They didn't linger long after that. The officers left with the same quiet authority they'd entered with. And Elijah watched as they crossed the street, returning to Simmons, who waited under the awning like he'd set the whole thing in motion. The rain fell harder now, drumming softly against the glass. By the time Elijah returned home, Amelia was already in the kitchen, the faint aroma of cornbread wafting through the house. She turned when he stepped inside, eyeing the dampness on his jacket. "Caught in the rain?" she asked. But her tone shifted when she saw his face. "Simmons," Elijah said simply. Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. "What did he do?" "Not much. Just enough to remind me he could." Amelia wiped her hands on a towel and crossed the room, standing in front of him with that same quiet strength she always carried. "They're not after the things you do, Elijah," she said softly. "It's the things you don't do. The things they think you shouldn't be allowed to have." Elijah nodded. He already knew that. The rain kept falling outside, steady and unyielding. Later that night, Elijah sat on the porch, the wooden steps creaking faintly under his weight. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still loomed overhead, dark and unsettled. A figure appeared at the end of the street. Even in the fading light, Elijah knew who it was. Simmons didn't cross the road. He stood on the opposite sidewalk, just far enough to let the street stretch between them like a boundary line neither was willing to cross. Elijah didn't move. He let the silence sit heavy between them, unmoving and unbending. And then, as if satisfied with the stalemate, Simmons disappeared into the night. Elijah stayed a little longer, letting the weight of the day roll off his shoulders, knowing tomorrow would come with its own storms. But storms didn't frighten him. Not anymore. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains, casting shadows that moved slowly across the wooden floor. Elijah sat at the small dining table, the newspaper spread out before him, though his eyes barely registered the headlines. The creak of Amelia's footsteps in the kitchen was a steady rhythm behind him, a comfort that grounded him in the present. But his mind wasn't in the room. It hadn't been for days. Since the encounter at the cafe, Elijah found himself noticing things he had long learned to ignore. The way neighbors glanced at a beat too long when he passed. Or how the mailman's tone softened, as if compensating for something left unspoken. There was an undercurrent shifting in the air, one that Elijah recognized well. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was there, beneath the surface, quiet as breath. "Something wrong?" Amelia's voice pulled him back. Elijah glanced up as she placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been staring at that same page for 20 minutes, she said, sitting across from him. "You could have read the whole paper by now." Elijah smiled faintly, folding the newspaper. "Maybe there's nothing worth reading today." But Amelia knew better. "You saw Simmons again, didn't you?" Elijah's silence was answered enough. Amelia exhaled softly, tapping her fingers on the table. "You can't let him live in your head, Elijah. That's what he wants." "He's not in my head," Elijah replied, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure if it was true. Amelia gave him a long, measured look. "If you say so." But the doubt lingered between them. That afternoon, Elijah walked downtown, his steps slow and deliberate. The streets were busy but restrained, as if everyone moved under an unspoken agreement not to disturb the fragile peace that held the city together. He crossed paths with Reverend Carter outside the church, a man whose words carried weight even when spoken softly. "Elijah," Carter greeted, tipping his hat. "Good to see you out and about." Elijah returned the gesture. "Likewise, Reverend." There was a pause, brief but telling. "I heard about what happened," Carter said carefully, his eyes searching Elijah's face. "The cafe, the officers." Elijah met his gaze. "Word travels fast." Carter nodded. "It always does." He hesitated, as if measuring his next words. "Be careful, Elijah. Simmons is stirring up something. And people are paying attention." Elijah's expression didn't change, but something in his chest tightened. "I'm not looking for trouble," Elijah said. "I know," Carter replied, "but sometimes trouble comes looking for you." The Reverend's words followed him as he continued down the street, the weight of them pressing against his back. By evening, the town's quiet hum had settled into a hush. Elijah stood on the porch, watching as the first traces of twilight crept across the sky. A faint sound drifted from down the street. Shoes scuffing lightly against the pavement. Elijah didn't turn, but he already knew who it was. Simmons walked slowly, hands in his pockets, head tilted just enough to catch Elijah's silhouette against the fading light. He didn't speak, didn't cross the street. He simply stood there, lingering like the final note of a song that refused to fade. Elijah leaned against the porch railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The distance between them was not far, but it felt wide enough to span decades. After a while, Simmons disappeared down the road, his presence leaving behind the same restless quiet that had begun to sink into the town. Amelia appeared in the doorway behind Elijah, arms folded. "He was here again," she said softly. Elijah nodded. Amelia stepped forward, her hand brushing against his. "You know, you can't fight ghosts, Elijah." Elijah's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I'm not trying to fight him. I'm just making sure he knows I see him." Amelia studied his face for a long moment before turning back inside. Elijah remained on the porch, standing sentinel as the night deepened, the air heavy with the knowledge that the storm was no longer beneath the surface. It was rising. The night stretched long over Elijah's street, the dim glow of the gas lamps flickering uncertainty, as if the darkness itself pressed too close. Elijah sat in his armchair by the window, his gaze fixed on the empty road. The quiet was brittle, ready to crack under the weight of what wasn't being said. Amelia moved through the room softly, the familiar rustle of her skirt against the floor grounding him. But tonight, even the comfort of routine felt fragile. "Elijah," she said, pausing near the window. Her voice was steady, but the concern in her eyes betrayed her. "You haven't said much since dinner." "I've just been thinking," Elijah replied, though his voice carried the weight of something heavier. Amelia glanced toward the street. "Simmons?" Elijah's nod was barely perceptible. "He's been lingering more often," she continued. "That can't be a coincidence." "It's not," Elijah said quietly. "Men like him don't believe in coincidence. They believe in messages." A faint breeze rattled the window pane, and Elijah leaned forward, folding his hands. "And sometimes," he added, "they think they're the only ones who can send them." Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you planning to do?" For a moment, Elijah didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the empty street as though searching for the right words. Finally, he said, "I won't let him walk me into the ground." Amelia stepped closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to fight this alone." "I know," Elijah said, placing his hand over hers. "But that doesn't mean I can avoid the fight altogether." The next morning, Elijah left the house early. The air was crisp, carrying with it the murmurs of a town half awake. By the time he reached the general store, he could feel eyes on him. A handful of men gathered near the entrance, their conversation halting as Elijah approached. "Elijah," one of them greeted cautiously, tipping his hat. Elijah nodded in return, but he caught the hesitation in their voices, the slight edge to their stance. The weight of Simmons' presence was beginning to ripple outward, touching even those who preferred to stay neutral. As Elijah stepped inside, the owner, Mr. Langley, glanced up from behind the counter. His usual warm smile faltered just slightly. "Morning, Elijah," Langley said, clearing his throat. "Haven't seen you in a while." "I've been around," Elijah replied, his tone light but deliberate. Langley nodded, but Elijah could see the shift in his posture, the subtle tightening of his grip on the ledger, the way his eyes darted toward the window. "They say Simmons has been asking questions," Langley muttered after a pause, his voice low. Elijah met his gaze. "I imagine he has." Langley hesitated before adding, "Be careful, Elijah. Some men don't need much of a reason." Elijah's smile was faint, but there was no humor in it. "I know." Later that afternoon, Elijah found himself near the churchyard, the distant toll of bells marking the passing hours. Reverend Carter stood by the steps, speaking with a small group of parishioners. When he caught sight of Elijah, his expression darkened with recognition. "Elijah," Carter said, stepping forward, "I hear Simmons has been stirring again." Elijah met the Reverend's eyes, sensing the unspoken question behind his words. "He hasn't found what he's looking for." Elijah replied calmly. Carter's brow furrowed. And what exactly is he looking for? Elijah glanced toward the road. A reason. Carter's lips tightened, but he didn't press further. Elijah, he said after a moment. You know this isn't just about you. The whole town feels it. Elijah nodded. I know. Carter's gaze lingered on him. The weight of history pressing between them. Then you also know how these things tend to end. I do, Elijah said, his voice steady, but not this time. That evening, Elijah walked home with the sun dipping low on the horizon. As he approached his house, he saw a figure standing by the fence. Simmons, arms crossed, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Elijah didn't break stride. He walked straight to his porch and stopped at the bottom step. Turning to face the man. Simmons, Elijah greeted evenly. Simmons smirked faintly. Evening, Elijah. There was a pause, thick with the tension of unsaid words. You've been keeping an eye on me, Simmons remarked, his tone laced with something Elijah couldn't quite place. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. No more than you've been keeping an eye on me. Simmons chuckled softly. Fair enough. Another pause. You know, Simmons said, stepping closer. Men like you, sometimes they forget their place. Elijah's grip on the porch railing tightened, but his expression remained calm. I haven't forgotten a thing, Elijah replied, but maybe it's time men like you remember. Simmons' smirk faltered. If only for a second. You're not afraid to push your luck, are you? I stopped worrying about luck a long time ago, Elijah said. The two men stood in silence, the weight of the moment settling between them. Finally, Simmons tipped his hat. I suppose we'll see how long that lasts, he muttered before turning and walking away. Elijah watched him go, the tension in his chest slowly easing. Behind him, Amelia's voice drifted from the doorway. Elijah? He turned to her, offering a small but resolute smile. It's all right, he said softly, for now. But even as the night swallowed the last traces of daylight, Elijah knew the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun.